Hey everybody, welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday. We're the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut, and I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And I'm Justin Crisp.
And I want to say that I almost said, welcome to St. Scaffoldings. You may notice in the backdrop behind us a large scaffold, which is up in front of our Rev'd, which is our sacred screen of icons, and they're going to be refurbished and rehabilitated and come to new life. So that's what you're seeing in the background. So today we are in the season of Epiphany. Epiphany means manifestation of God in Christ. We are in the fourth Sunday, and quite interestingly, we have the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. We have the Beatitudes as an epiphany, and we have proclamations from Jesus that are sometimes paradoxical and progressive. So why don't we get started here? Matthew 5, verses 1 to 12. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you."
Wow, it's such a good gospel. So this is the opening, as you said, of the Sermon on the Mount. And, Jesus just sits down and in seconds has reversed everything about culture of this world, everything. And they're probably just agog. And what is he going to say next? But I would like to just start with a little framework that, reminder that Matthew is the first gospel in the New Testament, at least in its placement, if not it's not the earliest, but placed there. So it tends to get more attention and set the tone for all the other gospels. And Matthew, above all, is sort of paralleling the Old Testament movement through the grand salvation history. And there goes Jesus up the mountain like the new Moses, sits down to present a new sort of law of ethic. And, it's also, he's, and the whole sweeping narrative of Matthew is like the Exodus. In the beginning, Jesus' family had to flee the king who was going to kill all the babies and baby boys. And, in Matthew, there's this baptism through water and covenant through water, and Jesus is led into the temptation in the wilderness. And, so there's this whole new light, way of interpreting and looking back at the scripture. And so Matthew throughout will be pointing back to the Hebrew scriptures and recasting them in a new light with Jesus as this new lawgiver and teacher and savior. So I don't know, I think it's helpful to me anyway to remember that context for these first century followers of Jesus who were Jewish and this writer of this gospel.
Completely. I think that's driven home partly by Jesus going up the mountain like the new Moses, and then also the reference to the prophets here at the very end in the last beatitude, the reminder that just as those who are persecuted and spoken falsely of on account of Jesus, they are just like the prophets who were also persecuted. It is an incredibly Jewish text and an incredibly Jewish gospel. What's driven home for me in Matthew is that these are what I would call the tender Beatitudes. It's not that Luke's Beatitudes aren't as revolutionary. They're just as morally revolutionary. They're just as socially revolutionary. But these are much more tender than Luke's. So Luke's, for one thing, has a series of woes which follows the blesseds, and Luke also is very focused on the material. So blessed are the poor, the hungry, those who weep, and when people hate you, exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. And then you get the woes: woe to the rich, to those who are full, those who are laughing, and those who are spoken well of. Here you get both a different emphasis on the syllable with a couple of the Beatitudes that parallel the Lucan version. Like, instead of blessed are the poor, instead you get blessed are the poor in spirit, and so on. There's been a lot of hay made out of that in particular. Was Matthew trying to moderate the radicalness of Jesus' original teachings with regard to money and wealth in casting this as being about the poor in spirit rather than being about the materially poor? I'm less interested in that argument and more interested in the tenderness of all of the Matthean Beatitudes all the way through. Something that is completely missing from the Lucan version: blessed are those who mourn. Right? Blessed are those who mourn, and they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Speaking of the resonances between the Sermon on the Mount and features of the Hebrew Bible narrative, we have blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. The promise of seeing God here is I think, and this is where I'll stop. The promise of seeing God, which is given to those who are pure in heart by Jesus, is, I think, cast as an incredibly tender and beautiful thing. But it is not always beautiful and tender when depicted in the scriptures, right? Being in the presence of God is said to be terrifying in the sense of the sublime. It's at least terrifying, like you're looking down off of the top of a skyscraper or, off the top of a waterfall or something like that. There's a kind of vertiginous free fall that you enter into whenever you're in the presence of God. And then there's also just there's the possibility that, the texts may just be depicting seeing God as being utterly terrifying. There's a lot of meteorological stuff happening on top of Mount Sinai whenever Moses is up there. And the people have to prepare themselves in order to come into the presence of God, regardless of whether it's on top of Mount Sinai or if it is in the inner sanctum of the temple in Jerusalem and so on, because coming into the presence of God is thought to be a fearful thing in all of those senses. And here, seeing God is cast as both a moment of incredible intimacy, which has continuity with those earlier depictions, but also as something which is a kind of tender promise, which is on the same level as blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The promise of seeing God is something which is supposed to be a great consolation. And this is why I think this is one of the reasons why for so many, particularly medieval Christians, seeing God was the summary of the life of the world to come. You ask somebody like Thomas Aquinas, what is heaven? And the answer is the beatific vision. It is seeing God. And not just seeing God in the sense of a light show. I could say a lot about Thomas's version of heaven. But this promise of seeing God is thought to be the consummation of all human longing, and in some sense a salve for everything that might have gone wrong in one's life.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You've taught me some of that before, and I really love it when you return to it about what is the beatific vision and its role in our understanding of the consummation of our life. I think that, so a lot to say about that, but I want to maybe move us just a sidestep here a little bit, and maybe in between where both of you have been, and just talk about what is a beatitude. And I mean, when I was a kid, I thought the sermon, the Beatitudes were just, 9 random statements and the most popular thing that was the least popular thing, because everyone talked about the Beatitudes but didn't, who could follow such a thing? Just to say that a beatitude, it comes from the the word beatitude comes from the Latin word happy. And it, in the different scriptures, it's translated as blessed or happy or fortunate. And sometimes I've heard of congratulations. Haven't you heard that in some of the new ones where it's congratulations?
Eugene Peterson.
Is that Eugene Peterson? It is. That's where where I got that too. And there are just, I looked it up because I love these kind of numbers games. There are 40 Beatitudes in the Hebrew Scriptures. 25 are in the Psalms, 10 are in Wisdom. There are 44 Beatitudes in the New Testament, 30 in the 3 Gospels, 15 in Luke, 13 in Matthew, 2 in John, and 0 in Mark. And just to sort of, okay, so we've got these Beatitudes, and how do we translate them? The first Psalm, right? Psalm 1, happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or blessed is the one who doesn't walk in the way of the wicked. So here we go. Depending if you're in NRSV or NIV translations, we move these words around. And I from my perspective, the word blessed is a church word, unless you're from down south and they say, "Oh, bless your soul," or whatever that way of insulting people is. I'm not from the south, so I can't remember.
Definitely
bless your heart. Oh yeah, not bless your soul. Boy, did I just show my northern or non-southern things there. Yeah, this guy is a loser. Anyway, just to say that we're talking about here in the different Beatitudes, and sometimes the Beatitudes come for blessings on being faithful to Jesus or being faithful to the law. But we're talking about something that might be thought of as, a kind of blissful or inward contentedness, a satisfaction of the soul, the state of satisfaction or comfort or comfort in the way that we might think of spiritual comfort, comfort ye my people, a spiritual consolation or spiritual sweetness, and that it's a state of the soul, not just a kind of passing emotion. So I think our word happy, a lot said about that in the study of happiness now, the happiness lab at Yale and stuff like that. What's the difference between happy and joy? And each of you have preached about that at different times. And so I find the word happy to be wildly unsatisfying for the depth of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
But I also find that, Beatitudes is such a churchy word that it's sometimes also unsatisfying.
Agree.
But,
Yeah, I'll build on what you both said, and one translation I've heard of blessed are, the word makaria in the Greek, it could be honorable. How honorable are the poor in spirit, and how honorable are those who mourn and are meek. And in the first century, this was an honor and shame kind of culture. And
interesting.
Even in the Psalms, shame came with poverty and shame came with, unrighteousness and things like that. But for Jesus, to be honorable is to stand on the side of those who are hungry and poor and thirsty and imprisoned. And so, comparing to Luke's blessings and woes, as you brought out, that was really helpful, Justin, to remember that contrast between Luke and Matthew. I think Matthew has also blessings and woes, but Matthew puts the woes further down the narrative when he talks about the sheep and the goats and, when I was hungry and thirsty and in prison, you came and gave me food.
That's a good call, Matthew 25. Yeah, that's a good call. I never would have taken the two and put them together. I like that.
So in the end, Jesus, from the beginning of his teaching, is framing honorability and blessedness or happiness or all of these ideas to be the way of discipleship. And, right before he goes up this mountain and sits down, he's teaching his disciples, and they have just dropped everything to follow him. They've taken on this call, and it's going to make them poor and hungry and tempted and weak and battered and, persecuted and all the things. And he starts right in, how honorable this call is. And the honor in itself isn't like their decrepitude or whatever that sets in. It's the fact that they're choosing this call is an honorable call. And in the end, the judgment will be, did you follow through by clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, bringing water to the thirsty, and freeing the imprisoned, and standing on the side of those people? It's not a removal from society or marginalization into, some kind of self-flagellating way of life. That's not the honorable way. It's more, you're in the mix of the world, standing on the side of those who are poor and oppressed and hungry. And so I think that he's bracketing these blessings and woes throughout the whole narrative. And then the whole thing is kind of with the huge exclamation point on the cross that Jesus embodies it with his body, So I thought that was an interesting translation.
Yeah, that is. I've not heard that. Yeah, I like that.
It's really very interesting. I have to say, I love the shout out to Psalm 1.
Yeah.
It was my grandfather, the Southern Baptist pastor. It was my grandfather's favorite psalm.
Oh, that's the coolest.
Which is pretty intense. It goes to show the intensity of his devotion to the Lord and his intensity just as a character on the stage of life. I mean, the version of that I memorized as a kid was, happy is the one who keeps not the counsel of the ungodly nor lingers in the ways of sinners. And anyway, I can hear my grandfather in his thick Southern accent.
Tennessee Baptist.
Yes, exactly. From the pulpit.
Wow.
From the mountains.
It was my grandmother asked for that song to be read at his funeral. And just say, not one of the recommended psalms in the Book of Common Prayer for funerals, right? Pretty intense first psalms, as my granny would say. But it is, the Beatitudes are a long tradition and in the Scriptures, and I love the translation of honor, and I love situating the Beatitudes as a kind of as an intervention made by Jesus in his cultural milieu, both Jewish and also Greek. So the most famous critic of the Beatitudes is, to my mind, Friedrich Nietzsche, who felt that the Beatitudes were the epitome of what he called slave morality. He had a theory in his book Genealogy of Morals, where he said that the masters had a version of morality, and it's an example of that for him is the morality of pagan Greece, and which is also the morality of Aristotle. So if you think about Odysseus on the one side and you think about Aristotelian ethics on the other, the meek, the mourning, the lost, and the losers are not the people who are said to be happy, right? Aristotle does not say that the mourning have eudaimonia, the Greek word for happiness, which is better translated flourishing. It's not what you get from Aristotle. These are, calling it the master morality immediately prejudices us against it, but Nietzsche says that's actually the problem, because what these figures were actually talking about, whether they were talking about Odysseus or talking about true happiness in the Aristotelian eudaimonistic sense, is they were talking about the life of nobility. They were talking about a life of strength and a life which was aimed towards beauty and aimed towards making yourself the most realized human being you could possibly be. Now, there's complicated ways of interpreting Nietzsche. I don't think that Nietzsche says that master morality is necessarily what we ought to go back to. He certainly likes it better than he likes slave morality, but I think he actually wants to go beyond good and evil. To quote another title of one of his books, he actually wants to go beyond good and evil into something like an aesthetic self-realization of the human being without any reference to any morality except that which orients us towards our vision of the beautiful. This is, for him, the ideal of the Superman or the Ubermensch, somebody who is not fettered by honor, shame, somebody who's not fettered by good and evil at all, regardless of whether one thinks that strength is good or weakness is good. But he certainly doesn't think that weakness is good, and he thinks that the Western world has been poisoned by Christianity, has been poisoned by the Beatitudes, and that the proof of this for him is how life-denying Christian asceticism becomes. He says that the world-denying character of slave morality, which is embedded in the Beatitudes, comes to fruition in the use of the word world as a pejorative, which we don't see necessarily in Matthew, but you do see in the Gospel according to John, right? The world is everything that is bad. And so he's like, it's completely life-denying. This is this is the what causes Nietzsche to break from Richard Wagner, who, with whom he was really enamored for a long time, because for Wagner the way of self-sacrifice comes back and is actually the secret to a flourishing life, just as it is for Jesus. He's the Superman, Siegfried, for those of you who know Wagner's operas and who are fans of them like I am, or a nerd about them like I am. Siegfried, the Superman, is not the hero. Brunhilde is the hero. Brunhilde, who gives her life for the world in a kind of Christ-like way. And so Nietzsche cannot stand the fact that Wagner has done this. He feels Wagner has betrayed everything that he cares about. He has celebrated weakness instead of strength. He has celebrated poverty of spirit instead of beauty and nobility of soul. I have to say I've staked my life on Nietzsche being wrong about this, but it does haunt me. My teacher, Miroslav Volf from Yale, he said that he used to keep a copy of Nietzsche by his bedside to remind him how high the stakes were.
Bedside?
Yeah, the thing.
Another place to put that book.
I know. The thing about Nietzsche that Miroslav always said is that he can see Christianity for what it is. In rejecting it, he really rejects the thing as it really is. It is the valorization of the underside, right? It's the valorization of weakness, or it's the gamble that weakness is actually strength, and so on. That self-sacrifice is actually the way of life. The way of the cross is the way of life. Nietzsche gets Christianity right even as he rejects it, but the possibility that we might be wrong and Nietzsche might be right is one that is always like hovering kind of right here. If I didn't believe in the God of Christianity, I don't think I would be living my life oriented towards the values that I do. I don't think that I would find this incredibly persuasive if I wasn't already so embedded in the Christian life. I don't think if I thought this God wasn't real, if this teaching didn't have that kind of divine sanction and authority, that I would find it naturally compelling to me, because it is a really counterintuitive way to live.
Amen to that. Wow, that was beautiful what you just said, including the book. Putting that Nietzsche thing on your bedside table here. I mean,
I don't keep Nietzsche on my bedside.
I'm still
table.
in that J.K. Rowling book, which I've been on since the first podcast. But anyway, so you're talking about some super serious heavyweight stuff. Let me take a whack at answering it in the way that the Beatitudes might answer it.
Yep.
And I think that to understand the Beatitudes, one has to understand the depth of spiritual life. So short of understanding the spiritual life, you can't understand the Beatitudes because they make no sense. And so the experienced presence of the divine can change some things. So, as I said at the early portion, at the kickoff portion of this, that we had proclamations that were sometimes paradoxical, and that in their paradoxical nature, they were also progressive. And so, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so, as I understand it, and I'll just give you just a real brief through these, and then we can stop in and go maybe through one by one or touch upon these.
I want to answer him too.
The poor in spirit. In other words, this is humility. This is a motion of kenosis, a spiritual kenosis, a kind of emptying of self, and that in the emptying of self, this would be the Buddhist way, right? That's only emptying. But we would find in the Christian way that the emptying leads to the kingdom of heaven. So we enter when we empty the kingdom of ourselves, we start to get the kingdom of the divine, and that leads to this question of blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I think the mourning is a twofold. One is the letting go, the sadness of letting go of things of the world, so to speak, letting go of the things of that you have loved, and also the desire for the sorrow over the fallen nature of our world, and that causes you pain. I mean, I think that you have that very, very much in your heart. The fallenness of the world, I think, is very painful to you, and that's why you do come back to violence, and Gerard often it's very, very experienced in you, and then say they'll be comforted, and this is the comfort ye, my people, from Isaiah 40. This kind of comfort is in the tradition known as spiritual consolation, not spiritual sweetness, which can come and go, but consolation is that deep, deep place where the Spirit is. And then blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth here. And I think this is the thing that probably gets Nietzsche so fired up. And that, the phrase is, to be meek is not to be weak. And so to be meek is to be gentle. And you can be like Hagrid in Hagrid was a big man, and it's
a great example,
and a very strong man. We're now back to J.K. Rowling, but he was meek in heart, and so he was gentle, and that I think it was Aquinas who thought that this meekness was gentleness, and that in your gentleness you can inherit things because you have made room for that, and then to hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they'll be filled, and so to have the desire for thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, to have the desire for that that godly stuff to be manifested in the world is a way that you're filled, give us this day our daily bread, the spiritual bread that comes from those who hunger. Yep. And we all have our heroes here, right? I mean, William Barber, just getting hired by the Yale Divinity School, probably has this in great spades. Totally. And then as a result of those dispositions, we find that we have, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. The fruits of the Spirit, the fruits of those dispositions are to be merciful, because you experience mercy, so you can be merciful. And purity of heart is nothing we can come up with on our own. That's a gift of the Spirit. And through the cleansing of our heart, we begin to be able to see the divine, and using sight, and maybe a lot to say about that. You've already touched on that so beautifully. And then the third disposition is that these dispositions make us peacemakers. Because our heart is at peace, we then can be peacemakers. And you're Gerard, and you can't fight your way to peace, kind of thing. You can only be at peace. You need to be peaceful to make peace. This is something the Dalai Lama's got a lot to say about. And the Dalai Lama does point toward Jesus. And children of God, we become as we're supposed to be, children of God in that way. But this is so countercultural to the place where you started. The counterculturalness is what leads us to being persecuted, right? But when we're persecuted, this gets into some kind of funky stuff, right? So people start to dislike you because you have these holy dispositions. This is holiness as happiness, and then these dispositions bring you to a place where, if you're persecuted for the kingdom of heaven, or you're persecuted for Jesus' sake, they reviled, rejoice, in your reward's going to be great, because that actually is the holy. This is that thing, and it's in the wedding service. Remember that, and just before the wedding blessing, it says, we give you thanks for making the cross to be the way of life, for the way of the cross to be the way of life. I always think that sounds, even in the wedding service, like, oh, yeesh. So I get that, but there's something about how we might say is a spiritual response to Nietzsche's, like, give me a break.
That's good.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche, he is naming the place where the church becomes the stumbling block and not the cornerstone.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. I wish we had a mic to go.
Click. Don't dare drop this expensive mic. But because it stops short. It's like, just as I was trying to say before, that Jesus isn't honoring and blessing the fact of being poor and weak and hungry. He's honoring and blessing the choosing of a way of life that is not afraid of these things, and not afraid to stand on the side of the people who are suffering those things. Yeah. And so when the church or people who follow the way of Jesus are poor in spirit or meek, they're people who've chosen a call to stand with both feet on the side of people who are victimized by our culture that is driven by power, acquisition, domination, all these things, fear, control, and it's on the way somewhere. It's not a stopping place, like an end in itself to be poor and meek and, woeful. That's like, we're woeful and sorrowful because the world's stuck in this place of oppression and control and domination of one another and killing people. And our systems are victimizing people, whole populations. Yeah. And that is where, that stuff's not blessed and honorable. It's not honorable to live in the path of destruction. Nobody chooses that. It's our whole world that's caught in that kind of flow. And to see the way of the cross, the way of the cross is to like put yourself there to stop it, to help stop it and to do things that will reverse course. And it's done by meekness, gentleness, but meek, that word, it's I forget what the word is, praos in the Greek. It means humble, but right. There's a study of that, a great sort of exegesis of that word meek, going back to Zechariah 9 and how, your king comes to you riding on a foal. Oh, wow. Like the colt of a donkey, right. Of a horse, and not a war horse. And then in Matthew, we get Jesus echoing that, the king comes riding on a donkey. This is a non-violent show. It isn't about weakness or meekness in the sense of timid. It's quite the opposite. It's like bold, strong, non-violent stance, but that's gentle. Yeah. So I think that Nietzsche and that whole idea that Christianity is just a big, dumpy waste of time, or gonna get you nowhere because it's too weak. That's because it stops at the bottom of the solidarity and doesn't see that it's on the way to a resurrection. This whole like ushering in of a kingdom of God. And if N.T. Wright contributed anything to theology, it's that heaven is a parallel reality. It's God's life reality world happening right now while the world's living its reality. And if you're meek and you'll inherit the earth, I don't know, N.T. Wright has this whole notion of the heaven and earth gradually coming together, right? I think you can probably shed more light on that.
It's in Surprised by Hope. You got it exactly right.
The progressive joining of heaven to earth. Yep. And, when Jesus teaches us to pray, he says, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, as it is right now in heaven. Yep. So, heaven's not a place you go only when you die. It's a place you flow into when you start to see God, I think. So anyway, that's would be my response to a Nietzsche. And I'd love to see Jesus and Nietzsche go at it, because he would probably say, honorable or blessed are those who are not scandalized by me. Because he's scandalized by that sense of weakness. Yeah. But he doesn't get it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm learning so much from both of you, as I always do.
Same.
This is really, really interesting to me because it's existential. I think that when I'm talking to the 8th grade confirmation students, this is part of what I'm talking about, right? Confirmation for me is not just about like whether you can tick every article off of the creeds and be like, yeah, okay, I believe that, I believe that, I believe that, I believe that. It's about finding the way of Jesus to be the vocation of one's life. Is this the universe in which you want to live? Is this the world which you believe is the true one or not? Now, how to do that as an 8th grader, it's pretty tall stakes, right? I think it's quite aspirational, but I think that if the sacrament of confirmation means anything, it's about being given the grace to live that form of Christ-like life in a world which is always kind of, bumping up against it. And it just as Jesus says that it would. I think that for me, when I have tried to live in this way in parts of my life, I have discovered that the world is as you all say it is. I have discovered that these spiritual disciplines do yield life. I have seen that the way of the cross is the way of life, and that the resurrection, the life of the resurrection, was it vindicates all of this. I'm reminded of the fact that one of the earliest Christian ways of talking about the cross and the resurrection is Christus Victor, Christ the victor, and that the resurrection in some fashion vindicates the way of the cross as the way of life in Jesus's case and in everybody else's. I think that this is a way of life where when you live it, you discover that God is real and that the world really is put together in this way. I do think Nietzsche's useful so far as, he paints a useful caricature. And I think that parts of his diagnosis of Christianity when it becomes world-denying, I think isn't actually faithful to the God of Christians. We do have in our tradition these world-denying tendencies that you can see in particularly extreme forms of asceticism in particular periods. Moments where if you were to ask some theologians, I'm trying to think of an example, but it would take me a little while to come up with one. Where you might ask a theologian, is there any reason for you to stick around, or would you be okay if you just died today? And if the whole point is to enjoy the good of God's own life forever in heaven, is there any purpose to this life, to this world, etc.? And some theologians have a kind of hard time answering that question. Well, why is this world good? What is this world about? What is this life for, etc.? That's actually unfaithful to Christianity. And so Nietzsche, so far as he can show that there are tendencies in our tradition which are world denying, he's helpful for us, to kind of clear those away. I think he's also helpful in pointing out that sometimes the underdog can be out for revenge. And I think that some of the horrors of the 20th century showed us that movements, particularly in the communist world, which were ostensibly democratic and done in the name of the poor, the weak, the downtrodden, etc., turned out to be wills to power all of their own. Right. Lenin was no hero, right? Even though a lot of Lenin's rhetoric sounded like the Beatitudes. It was like the false Beatitudes. And so far as Nietzsche's got Lenin's number in that regard, and has the number of any moment when those who were once oppressed become the oppressors, which I think this is a lot of what my teacher Miroslav's book Exclusion and Embrace is about, having grown up in the former Yugoslavia and the incredible ethnic strife in the former Yugoslavia. In any case, this transformation of us and our world into a world of peace is the result of the way of the cross. And it can go awry in so many different directions. It can go awry because you don't buy Jesus here, or it can go awry because you buy Jesus here but just use what Jesus is saying to do what everybody else is doing. Is a kind of tit for tat. I'm the winner, you're the loser. It's the whole point of the Beatitudes, I think, is to get beyond not good and evil, but beyond winners and losers. It's an entirely different world.
Wow. Yeah. So much to process in all that you just said. While you were speaking and we were thinking of this, I had this memory of walking down 16th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue when I first started to take Jesus seriously. And I was walking out of an enormous Jesuit Catholic church and walking up the street. And I remember feeling a certain amount of relief and release in my life, and that was that that I had hoped that I would no longer use competition in a particular game as the battle that I had to fight. And so whether or not I was going to be a senior vice president at an investment bank down in Wall Street, or whether or not I was going to be a super uber cool dude in an advertising agency in New York, I just took all that stuff, neither of which I was, by the way, an utter failure in both, and just set it aside, and that there was a new game in town. And the new game in town was Jesus and the way that he taught to live. And it set aside a tremendous numbers of the games people play. And in setting aside those games, it was such a repositioning. And in the repositioning, it had to do with the disposition of the heart, which would bring us into the disposition of God, which would bring us and put us in a position to experience God as alive, to experience the living Christ. And one of the commentators I was listening to in preparation for our conversations this morning noted that Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, had said that the Beatitudes lift up the veil on the inner life of Christ, or something like that, on the heart of Jesus. And I remember walking down 16th Street and having some kind of, how do you describe that? A kind of glimpse of the heart, or a glimpse of the heart, because it's experienced. It's not experienced here. It's experienced it's experienced here.
An epiphany.
But you see it, but you feel it. And realizing that Jesus was talking about a completely different thing. Mm-hmm. It was a completely different thing. And then most of the people, and I was watching the people come and go down the streets, like this is what the streets of New York look like, right? And that there was a different game. And in the different game, it would change you. And that I remember thinking, oh no, what will my future in-laws think of me? As I just was wanting to change the way I was and who I was. And that's, and I think that gets a little bit of what Jesus is talking about here. My in-laws all accepted me. This was not a whack of my in-laws, not at all. But I remember that was the thought that came to my mind, which is, I'm going to be living I would like to live a completely different way. Yeah. And now what is the problem with the church? The problem with the church is we haven't gone far enough. We didn't go all the way, right? And we got stuck in the middle. And I would just say, I've now been devoted to Jesus for, seriously for a pretty long time. Not as long as you, because you started when you were like 3, and you were awakened before I was still working on my NBA career way up until it was long gone. That wasn't going to happen. And then in the professional, every soccer and all that didn't work out. But so I'm the latecomer to this for you guys. But that, I would say the compromises of the church and the compromises of my own life, the realities of trying to, have enough to have 5 children. And I would sometimes say, oh my gosh, I've lost my way. I've gone too much to the middle. Nobody would have I could have no impact on anybody, because it just got super muddy and super messy. So that what happened to me in 16th Street, I didn't end up walking around in white clothes with signs saying "Follow Jesus," in the subway. It didn't end up in that very extreme place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think. I think that there's no stacking up of our years of not doing it, or our lifetime of doing it. It's more like every moment is its own eternity. We just do it now, and you just turn. And Jesus, it's a practice of turning. And also, I wanted to just mention that Jesus's followers and he himself were not rejecting people ever. And the church sometimes gets the bad name, or we get those labels of kind of embarrassment and icky way to live by the world, because we're guilty of sort of rejecting people, and we're like an either or institution where there are winners and losers, just like the world is doing. But with Jesus, he was rejecting a cultural movement of, violence and all that, but never rejecting the people. I mean, he was always on the side of the people, whoever they were, whatever kind of milieu they had or whatever choices they made. He was with Nietzsche. He was with our in-laws. He was with our bosses and our enemies, and, always with all of us, but not with the systems where we're turning people away or flogging ourselves or separating ourselves into camps. I mean, that's exactly what this is about not doing. So I feel like it is the third way. It is a whole new game. It's not another new either or game. It's not another game of creating outsiders and stuff. I mean, that's where we miss it. And that's where the church is scandalous, because it's created outsiders.
Right.
when it has done that. And when it hasn't done that, it's being the real thing. So I don't know. It's hard to institutionalize something when Jesus himself was rejected by the institutions that were respected in his day. So, I don't know. I just feel like there is a great mercy in the sense that we never really fully know when we're getting it right or not. And it's not our institutions that get it right. It gives us a space to work it out with one another.
Totally.
But, you can't institutionalize this stuff. It's so deep in the heart, and it's just so moment by moment, choice by choice, person by person. And, can't really bottle and sell it.
Completely with you. I think it's a whole being orientation that is playing out in individual discrete moments in different ways in different people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up wearing one of those "What would Jesus do" bracelets, which at some level is still the question which I ask myself all the time. I ask, what would Jesus do? But actually I've stopped asking that. I've asked myself, what is Jesus calling me to do? Because I live a different life than Jesus did, right? Jesus didn't have 5 children.
What would Jesus?
It's like what would Jesus call? What is Jesus calling Peter to do? What is Jesus calling Elizabeth to do and Justin to do in our particular time, in our particular place, in our particular circumstances? The Beatitudes, the way of life which is embedded in the Beatitudes, is this valorization of compassion, suffering with, as the secret to life, as the heart of true strength, as what is actually the grain of the world. It goes with the grain of the world, even when it doesn't. It goes with the grain of God's creation as unfallen, even if it doesn't seem it, even if you end up dead, even if you end up excluded, reviled, and persecuted, and so on. This is still the way that God created the world to be, because in some sense I think it's a reflection of God's own inner life, but that's another story. But this way of compassion is, at some level, I had to just kind of give my heart to it, aspirationally, because I just think it's beautiful. I just think it's gorgeous. It's not that I reasoned my way to it. I mean, because when I try to reason my way to it, I'm like, I don't know. Nietzsche had a few points about this or that or the other, or anybody, not just Nietzsche, but like Aristotle. This is pretty extreme stuff Jesus is putting out there in like the history of moral ideas. I don't reason my way to it. I just think it's the most gorgeous thing in the world. It reminds me, Rowan Williams says that the way that people actually find God credible, the way that people come to believe in God, is not so much by like reading a bunch of proofs and then becoming intellectually convinced, okay, I think that this version of God is real, or so on and so forth. It's rather that they see people who are living as though God were real, and they find themselves just so strangely compelled by the beauty of their lives that they think, oh wow, I want to live in that world too. And so I saw I saw my grandparents living this way, and my parents living this way. The lives of priests in the Episcopal Church are certainly complicated. In the lives of the people trying to live in an institutional church and trying to live this way of compassion, certainly complicated. But my dad is a small business owner in American manufacturing at the turn of the 21st century. Hugely complicated to figure out how to live this, right? And it was their wrestling with it, their attempt to be faithful with it, that I was like, oh my gosh, this is so hard. And I think it gives them life. And I think it's just so beautiful. I had to give my heart to it. That was my version of the 16th Street experience, and that was my version of the what causes me to try to in these micro decisions to choose this way of love over the way of power.
Beautiful. These are the Beatitudes, and we're going to end here with beautiful. It seems just like the right spot. We're grateful to all of you who have hung in with us. We love it if you would share and like and comment so that we might all together as a community deepen ourselves in Jesus' teaching. This coming Sunday is the 4th Sunday of Epiphany, and their service is here at St. Mark's at 8, 9, and 10. The 10 o'clock service can be streamed. So God bless you and peace be with you. See you again soon.